Imagine, for a moment, the quiet of an old village, many centuries ago. The night has fallen gently across the land, and the familiar hum of the day has stilled into silence. The streets are narrow and uneven, paved with cobblestones that glisten faintly with moisture, as if the mist itself has laid down to rest upon them. There are no electric lamps brightening the lanes, no neon signs flickering in windows, no restless traffic humming through the dark. Instead, the village is softened by the tender flicker of lanterns hanging from doorways and mounted on wooden posts, their glow swaying lightly as the evening breeze drifts by. The air carries a crispness, tinged with the faint smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and the distant sweetness of hay stored in barns. A slow river winds nearby, its waters dark and reflective, catching the pale shimmer of the moon as it drifts high above. Everything is hushed, as if the world has slipped into a slower rhythm, a rhythm that belongs entirely to the night. In this village, light itself is a treasure, something to be guarded and cherished. Before the age of switches and bulbs, when the simple motion of a finger could flood a room with brightness, the world lived in deeper shadows. Darkness was not an inconvenience to be brushed away. It was a natural part of existence, stretching long across evenings, lingering heavily through winters, and shaping the way people lived their days. To break that darkness, even slightly, was to create a sanctuary, a circle of warmth and vision against the endless quiet of night. And at the heart of this sanctuary stood the candle, small, handmade, fragile, yet steady, glowing modestly in its place. Its flame was never overwhelming, never harsh. Instead, it was patient and constant, offering its soft light to anyone who gathered near. A candle was more than wax and wick. It was the silent witness of countless evenings, lighting the pages of worn books, illuminating the faces of families gathered around meals, casting gentle shadows against timber walls while stories were whispered before bed. It was there during prayers, its steady flame reflecting the devotion of the faithful. It was present in workshops, helping hands stitch, carve, and mend even after the sun had disappeared. To burn a candle was to extend the day just a little longer, to reach into the night with a fragile but comforting glow. And yet, behind this everyday miracle lay a process both humble and fascinating, the slow and careful craft of making candles by hand. Tonight, we will wander into that story, not in haste, but gently, as if walking along those misty cobblestone streets, lantern light guiding each step. We will imagine the hands that worked patiently to create these small flames, the rooms where the scent of warm tallow or sweet beeswax lingered, the tools worn smooth by use, and the quiet satisfaction of a household preparing its winter light. Step by step, we will explore how candles came into being, how they cooled, how they were shaped and stored, and how they eventually found their way into the hands of families who needed them. There is no drama here, no urgency, just the unfolding of a slow craft, one that stretched across generations and shaped the evenings of countless people. Picture the inside of a cottage, modest and warm. The hearth fire glows at the center, its light dancing across clay pots and wooden beams. Beside it, a pot simmers, filled with rendered tallow, its faint scent mixing with smoke. On the table lies a bundle of wicks, twisted from flax or hemp, prepared by careful hands earlier in the day. Children peer curiously as their mother dips each wick into the warm liquid, lifts it out to cool, and repeats the motion again and again. The layers building slowly, hanging from rods nearby, rows of pale candles begin to take form, each one waiting patiently to solidify, each one destined to bring comfort in the long winter nights to come. It is not a hurried task, but a steady, rhythmic one dip, lift, cool, repeat. The very slowness of the work is part of its beauty. And outside, as the candles take shape indoors, the village remains wrapped in its evening hush. The river still glides, reflecting broken lantern light, while the mist curls around the edges of fields. A dog settles in straw, a rooster sleeps upon its perch, and the only sounds are the quiet murmur of distant voices and the occasional creak of wood. The world moves slowly here, unhurried and content. Every flame that will soon be lit was born from this calm, from patient repetition and simple tools, from the care of those who understood how vital even the smallest bit of light could be. So let us drift gently into this history together, as though by candlelight itself. We will not rush. There is no need. Instead, we will move at the same pace as the craft once did, slow, deliberate, careful. We will imagine the gathering of materials, the melting and straining, the dipping and molding, the cooling and storing. we will walk quietly through homes, workshops, and chapels, noticing how a candle was never merely an object, but a part of daily rhythm, a companion in the long hours of dark. As we wander, the glow of these handmade lights will guide us, steady and unwavering, reminding us of the patience and resourcefulness of those who came before. And as the night deepens around us, perhaps you can picture a single candle glowing nearby its flame, small but sure, flickering softly, casting long shadows that stretch across the floor and ceiling. Notice how the glow seems to breathe in the still air, how it seems almost alive, how it invites the mind to slow and the body to rest. It is this glow that carried countless generations into their nights, calming their fears, easing their work, and comforting their rest. It is this same glow that we will follow tonight, as we step gently into the story of how candles were made, and how such a simple craft once shaped the rhythm of human life. Imagine a world where darkness was not a choice but a certainty, a world before switches, before bulbs, before the soft hum of electricity filled every corner of life. When the sun set, the colors of the day faded completely. The fields beyond the village grew dim, the river lost its sparkle, and homes of timber, stone, or clay slipped into shadow. There was no rushing to stay awake with glowing screens or humming lamps. The night belonged to stillness and silence, to the gentle rhythm of rest. Yet even in that deep and natural darkness, people longed for a little comfort. They wanted a small flame to push the shadows back, to hold on to the day just a little longer, to gather around a fragile glow that reassured them that life had not vanished into the dark. And so, in these early homes, the value of light was beyond measure. Picture an ordinary cottage, standing quietly on the edge of a field. Its roof is thatched, smelling faintly of straw and earth. Its walls are whitewashed with lime, uneven but sturdy. The wooden door creaks softly as it closes against the evening breeze. Inside, the hearth burns steadily at the center of the room, sending warmth into the air and filling the rafters with a faint haze of smoke. Families gather here to cook simple meals in iron pots, to bake bread on stones, to stir herbs into broth. The fire is generous, but its light does not stretch far. And when the flames die down, the cottage is soon swallowed in darkness. It is then that the candle is brought forward, rough and plain, made from tallow, gathered over many weeks. Placed carefully in a holder of wood or iron, its wick is lit, and with it a small circle of light blooms. The room shifts, shadows retreat to corners, faces become visible again, and the work of evening can continue. This was the light of ordinary homes, fragile, modest, and deeply treasured. Candles were never used carelessly. They represented labor, the hours of rendering fat from animals, the saving of kitchen scraps, the tending of hives in summer, or the trading of goods at the market. To waste a candle was to waste someone's time, someone's effort, someone's patient skill. Families used them with caution. A single candle might be placed at the supper table, its soft glow falling across bowls of porridge, hunks of bread, or salted fish. Another might stand beside a mother as she repaired clothing, her hands steady in the narrow circle of light. Children sometimes sat nearby, tracing letters or listening to a story, the flickering flame holding back their sleep for just a little while longer. And sometimes a candle burned near a bed, its glow calming fears of shadows that crept across the rafters. The houses themselves were shaped by this rhythm of light and dark. Windows were small and shuttered to keep out rain and wind. Walls were thick, built to preserve warmth, yet drafts still slipped through cracks. Beyond the glow of a single candle, the rest of the room often lay in gloom. This balance between brightness and shadow framed every evening, teaching families to value the small flame that carried them through the long night. To light a candle was never casual. It was a decision to extend the day or surrender to sleep. People rose early with the sun, worked long hours in fields or workshops, and by dusk their bodies were weary. Yet there were times when work could not wait. A father might stay awake to mend a broken tool. A scholar might continue his studies, parchment spread on a wooden desk. A mother might rock an infant, her face lit softly by the wick. To light a candle was to feel safe. Darkness could be unsettling, filling corners with imagined figures, whispering fears into tired minds. The candle, though modest, anchored the heart. Its glow reminded families they were not alone, that the night could be met with patience and calm. The flame was a companion, small but constant. It gave reassurance that morning would come, as it always did. Seasons deepened this reliance. In summer, the sun lingered, and candles were seldom needed. Children played in the fading twilight, and meals stretched late into the evening without the aid of flame. But in winter, when darkness arrived early and stretched endlessly, candles became essential. Families planned for this. They stored tallow after autumn slaughter, or bought bundles from the village chandler. They counted each one carefully, using them sparingly so the supply would last until spring. Some nights, a candle burned for only an hour before being pinched out, its stub saved. Children were warned never to touch them without permission. Candles were not toys, nor decorations, but part of survival, as vital as firewood or food. Now imagine the glow of a candle in a farmhouse kitchen. A father repairs the handle of a tool, his face bent close to the light. A mother stitches a piece of fabric, the needle glinting in the glow. Children lean forward to hear a story, their eyes heavy, their shadows large against the wall. The dog lies curled near the hearth, its chest rising and falling in sleep. The fire has burned down to embers, yet the candle holds the room together. Outside, frost covers the ground, but within the little circle of light, the family feels safe. Or picture a scholar in a study, parchment spread across a table, ink drying slowly beside him. The air smells of wax and leather bindings. The flame flickers as a cold wind presses against the shutters. Here, the candle allows thought to stretch into the night, giving space for words and ideas that otherwise would have been lost to darkness. The value of light was not only practical, but emotional. Candlelight softened the world. It drew families together. It gave warmth to conversation and made silence feel companionable rather than empty. In churches, candles symbolized devotion and prayer, their flame steady in still air. In cottages, they symbolized comfort and survival, warding off the fears that came with night. The flame seemed almost alive, trembling, breathing, carrying a quiet reminder that life itself was fragile yet enduring. When we look back now, surrounded by lights that never flicker, it is easy to forget how precious such light once was. To us, it may seem ordinary, but for those who lived in the centuries before electricity, a candle was extraordinary because it made the ordinary possible. It made work possible, reading possible, prayer possible, storytelling possible. It gave children reassurance, gave parents a moment more of conversation, gave communities the ability to gather after dusk. Every candle carried within it the labor of many hands and the hope of many nights. And so, as the cottage we imagined grows quiet, the candle still burns. The family has gone to sleep, the children tucked beneath woolen blankets, the parents resting after long work. The dog sighs in its sleep, and the fire has cooled to ash. The candle glows softly, wax pooling slowly at its base. Soon it will be pinched out, and the night will take over again. But for now, it shines, doing exactly what it was meant to do, warding off shadows, carrying the family gently into rest, and reminding us of the deep value of light in early homes. In the quiet rhythm of old households, light did not simply appear. It was prepared, collected, and earned through patient labor. For many families across medieval villages and towns, the most common path toward light began not with honeybees or wax, which were rare luxuries, but with something far more ordinary: the scraps of animal fat that remained after meals and butchering. This fat, once melted and refined, became known as tallow. Its scent was strong, sometimes unpleasant, yet it offered a steady flame at a price people could afford. The gathering of tallow was neither glamorous nor ceremonious, but it was essential. It was part of the economy of the hearth, where nothing was wasted, and every byproduct of daily life found another use. Families, especially those of modest means, leaned upon this humble substance to extend their days, to keep shadows at bay, and to carry on the small but necessary tasks of evening. Imagine a kitchen in a medieval cottage, its hearth the heart of daily life. A pot of broth simmers gently, bones and scraps of meat stirring beneath the bubbling surface. The air smells of wood smoke and salt. Children sit nearby, waiting for their portion, while a mother skims the surface with a wooden spoon. On that spoon sometimes rises a film of fat, glistening in the firelight. It is not discarded. It is poured carefully into a small clay dish. Later, after the meal, pans and pots are scraped, drippings gathered, bits of fat trimmed from meat. Nothing is thrown away. Instead, each portion is saved, cooled, and set aside. Over time, these scraps accumulate, and eventually they will be melted down into the material needed to form candles. Thus, the very meals that nourished the body also gave birth to the light that would guide the family through dark nights. The work of rendering tallow was a task of patience. Once enough fat had been collected, it was placed in a pot over the fire. Slowly, steadily, it softened, then melted, releasing a smell that clung to the air. Ashes and dirt often mixed with it, for nothing in a household stayed entirely clean. But these impurities were strained away with cloth, leaving behind a liquid substance that cooled into pale, solid tallow. Though its odor could linger, its usefulness outweighed its faults. For families who could not afford beeswax, tallow was the light of the poor and the middle class alike. The act of saving tallow also reflected a broader truth about life in earlier centuries. Households wasted little. Every scrap of cloth was patched, every wooden tool mended, every grain measured. Food was preserved in salt, dried in smoke, stored in cellars. Animal bones became broth, hides became leather, sinew became cord. In this way, fat became light. The hearth was not only a place of warmth and cooking, but also a place of transformation, where resources shifted form. By the glow of the fire, what was once refuse became something precious. Families learned, through necessity, to look at everything with the eyes of use. Seasons shaped this cycle of gathering. After autumn slaughtering, when livestock were culled for winter, households were rich in fat. Families worked long days preserving meat, salting cuts, and preparing sausages. Alongside these tasks, fat was set aside to render into tallow. These were the months when supplies of candles could be prepared for the long winter ahead, when daylight shortened and shadows stretched from late afternoon into morning. In spring and summer, fat was scarcer, and households relied more heavily on the supply they had stored. The rhythm of the year was tied to light, and the gathering of tallow was one thread in that larger pattern. The smell of tallow, sharp and greasy, often filled homes during the rendering process. To modern senses, it may seem unpleasant, yet to families of the time, it was simply the smell of usefulness. It carried no shame, no surprise. It was part of life, like smoke in the rafters, damp on the walls, or the faint tang of salted fish stored in barrels. The house absorbed these odors, and the people within became accustomed. More than that, the smell of tallow meant security, for it promised that candles would be made, and evenings would not fall entirely to darkness. Children, too, knew the importance of saving fat. A child who licked a plate to clean might be gently scolded, not for greed, but for carelessness. A spoonful of fat left behind was not waste, but light stolen from the family. Children learned early to scrape bowls carefully, to help their mothers collect drippings, to assist in pouring cooled fat into small jars. These tasks taught them that every part of life was connected, that even the simplest action, saving a bit of grease, could help bring warmth and safety to the household. In larger towns, the gathering of tallow extended beyond single homes. Chandler's craftsmen dedicated to making candles often relied on the scraps brought in by families who preferred to exchange fat for finished candles. Some households rendered their own tallow, while others carried jars to the chandler, who melted, strained, and shaped the fat on a larger scale. The smell of such workshops was heavy, lingering in alleys and courtyards. Yet people tolerated it because the service was needed. Light was worth the odor. Markets smelled of many things: fish, leather, herbs, animals, and tallow was simply another thread in the tapestry of daily life. The process of saving tallow was steady and ordinary, but it reveals much about the values of the time. It shows us a world where thrift was survival, where patience was woven into every task. It reminds us that comfort did not come ready-made, but was built slowly, day by day, from the smallest fragments of life. It also shows us how interconnected the household was with the natural cycle. Animals raised in the field provided food, hides, tools, and light. Nothing stood apart. Everything was part of the whole. Now picture a family in late autumn. After a day of slaughtering livestock, the yard is busy, the air cold, the ground damp with straw and mud. Meat is hung on hooks, skins stretched to dry, pots boiling with broth. Amid all this labor, the fat is carefully gathered. A mother scrapes it into buckets. A father stirs a pot over the fire. Children carry small pieces to add to the pile. The smell is thick, but no one complains. This work ensures not only food but also light. When winter winds howl outside, when snow presses against the shutters, the candles made from this day's labor will burn inside, casting a small but steady glow across the room. For some, beeswax was the ideal cleaner, sweeter smelling, yet beeswax was costly, often reserved for churches, monasteries, or the wealthy. For ordinary families, tallow was reality. Its light was smoky, its scent lingering, but it was theirs. To them, it was not inferior, but familiar. The way their bread was coarse compared to fine white loaves of the rich, yet nourishing and beloved all the same. Tallow candles were the light of common life, as much a part of evenings as bread was of meals. As we look back now, it is easy to imagine the gathering of tallow as dull or unpleasant, but within its steady rhythm lies a kind of quiet beauty. It was an act of preparation, of foresight, of care for the family. It turned the scraps of the day into the safety of the night. It bound meals to memory, the hearth to the flame, and the body's nourishment to the mind's comfort. In remembering how people once gathered tallow, we also remember how they lived patiently, carefully, gratefully always mindful that every resource had meaning. And so, the hearth, glowing gently in the center of the cottage, was more than fire and warmth. It was a workshop, a kitchen, a place of transformation. From it came not only bread and broth, but also the promise of light. The gathering of tallow was a thread in the fabric of survival, woven into the quiet lives of families across centuries. Through this patient craft, darkness was not banished, but softened, held back just enough to give room for life, conversation, and rest. And in that small act, light became more than a flamet, became a symbol of endurance, of thrift, and of the enduring bond between the household and its humble hearth. In the quiet centuries before electric light, not all candles were created equal. For the majority of families, evenings were lit by smoky flames made from tallow, carrying with them the faint and heavy smell of animal fat. Yet there existed another form of light cleaner, brighter, more fragrant, that belonged mostly to the wealthy, to churches, and to This was the candle made of beeswax. Unlike the humble tallow candle, beeswax burned with a steady golden flame, producing little smoke and leaving behind only the faint sweetness of honey. It was a rare luxury, treasured not just for its light, but for what it represented: refinement, sacredness, and a connection to something pure and elevated. To light a beeswax candle was not an everyday act. It was a choice marked with significance, often reserved for ritual, ceremony, or celebration. Its glow was not simply illumination, it was atmosphere, reverence, and quiet beauty. Beeswax was difficult to obtain in large quantities, which gave it an aura of preciousness. Unlike animal fat, which could be gathered from the hearth as a natural byproduct of meals, beeswax required a careful partnership with nature. It came from the patient labor of bees, from the humming activity of hives that had to be tended, protected, and harvested. For most families, this was work beyond their reach. Maintaining hives was a skilled task, and even those who did so could only gather modest amounts of wax at a time. As a result, beeswax became a commodity, traded in markets, exchanged between villages, and guarded carefully by those who relied upon it for sacred or important occasions. Imagine, for a moment, the scene of a medieval marketplace where wax was sold. Amid stalls filled with wool, grain, salt, and vegetables, there might be a small table where a beekeeper displayed cakes of pale, golden wax. The scent, faint yet unmistakable, would carry in the era hint of honey, sunlit fields, and flowering meadows. Buyers who approached knew they were looking at something special, something beyond ordinary household goods. The wax would be weighed carefully, cut into blocks, and wrapped for safe transport. To purchase even a small piece was to invest in a light that would not sting the eyes or fill the home with smoke. It was a purchase that symbolized care, wealth, and foresight. For churches and monasteries, beeswax was more than a luxury, it was a necessity. In sacred spaces, the symbolism of light mattered deeply. The clean, golden flame of beeswax carried spiritual meaning, purity, devotion, and the presence of the divine. Chapels glowed with rows of beeswax candles, their light reflected against stone walls, flickering over carved saints and stained glass. To enter such a space at night was to step into a world set apart from ordinary life, where shadows receded and the silence of prayer mingled with the soft hum of beeswax flames. The very atmosphere was transformed, slowed, and sanctified by that rare glow. For monks and clergy, the expense of beeswax was justified by its symbolism, and it became one of the most consistent uses for the substance across centuries. Nobles and wealthy households too often turned to beeswax for their gatherings, Banquets, feasts, and festive evenings were lit, not only by the warmth of fire, but also by the steady gleam of beeswax candles placed upon long tables or set within iron holders along the walls. The fragrance, light, and absence of heavy smoke made such spaces feel refined, more comfortable, more celebratory. To be bathed in beeswax light was to experience life at its most polished, where even the smallest details spoke of abundance and refinement. For the poor, such sights were rare glimpses, perhaps only seen when attending church on feast days or walking past the homes of the wealthy. Yet even these glimpses carried power. They created an awareness of a different kind of life, a life where light itself seemed smoother, sweeter, and closer to beauty. The process of harvesting beeswax was delicate. Beekeepers approached hives with care, for bees were protective of their labor. Hives were often made of skeps-woven domes of straw, set in sheltered corners of gardens or fields. The buzzing of thousands of bees filled the air, and the keeper worked slowly, with smoke to calm the hive and careful hands to remove honey. From these combs came honey for eating and trade, but also wax, pressed out and cleaned before it could be molded into candles. This work required skill and patience, and though it yielded rewards, it was never effortless. The bees had to be tended through the seasons, protected from storms, disease, and hungry creatures. Each ounce of wax carried with it the quiet story of hundreds of bees and the human hands that guided their world. Because it was difficult to obtain, beeswax often traveled long distances. Traders carried it across regions, from villages with healthy hives to towns where demand was high. In some areas, it became a form of currency, valued alongside salt, cloth, and spices. Its rarity gave it weight in negotiation, and its uses ensured that it was never unwanted. Markets in cities echoed with bargaining over wax, and church treasuries often kept careful records of wax purchases, alongside wine, bread, and oil. The life of bees thus became intertwined with the life of commerce, linking the quiet hum of a hive to the bustling energy of trade routes. For ordinary families, the thought of owning beeswax candles was often little more than a dream. They knew of them, they saw them in churches, but they rarely touched them. Instead, they relied on tallow, smoky and sharp, while admiring from a distance the golden glow that marked wealth and sacredness. Yet this distance did not create resentment, it created awe. The presence of beeswax in churches elevated the experience of worship, making the sacred spaces feel otherworldly. Its rarity ensured that it carried meaning. A light too common might have lost its symbolism, but beeswax retained its power precisely because it was not for every home. Picture a small chapel in the countryside, stone walls cool and rough, wooden benches worn smooth by generations. Evening has fallen, and outside the wind stirs through trees. Inside, the space is transformed by beeswax candles. Their glow rests gently on the faces of worshippers, softening lines of care, highlighting bowed heads. The air is touched by a faint sweetness, almost imperceptible, but enough to soften the atmosphere further. The flickering flames move across painted icons, carved crosses, and simple altars. Time itself seems to slow, each moment held in that steady golden light. For those gathered there, the candle is not merely practical, it is a reminder of the sacred rhythm of life, of seasons, of devotion, of a world beyond the ordinary. The symbolism of beeswax extended beyond churches and wealth. Over centuries, it came to embody qualities admired in life: purity, patience, and resilience. Just as bees worked tirelessly, creating wax through their endless gathering of nectar, so too were humans reminded of the value of steady labor, of quiet industry, of persistence. The candle became a metaphor not only for light, but for life lived in devotion and service. This symbolism, woven into religious teaching and cultural imagination, gave beeswax candles a place far greater than their material worth. They became symbols of endurance, of holiness, and of the delicate balance between human life and the natural world. As centuries passed, methods of tending hives improved, and beekeeping spread more widely. Still, the demand for wax continued to outpace its supply. Churches, monasteries, and wealthy estates consumed it in large quantities, while ordinary people remained dependent on tallow. Yet, even as it remained a rarity, beeswax carried with it a sense of possibility. To dream of lighting such a candle was to dream of a life with a little more ease, a little more beauty, a little more connection to something elevated. That dream, quiet and enduring, gave beeswax a place in the imagination of people across generations. The beauty of beeswax candles lay not only in their light, but in the atmosphere they created. A beeswax flame was steady, its glow warmer than tallow, its scent softer and sweeter. A room lit by beeswax felt calmer, cleaner, more welcoming, for gatherings, for rituals, for nights of celebration. They transformed ordinary walls into spaces of comfort and significance. Even today, when electricity has long replaced the candle as necessity, beeswax retains this aura. It is still valued for its purity, its fragrance, its gentle glow. It carries forward the history of centuries, reminding us that light has always been more than function. It has been beauty, symbolism, and presence. To reflect on beeswax is to reflect on the way people once saw the world. It shows us how scarcity gave meaning, how rarity turned necessity into luxury, how light became a symbol of refinement. It shows us the patience of beekeepers, the devotion of monks, the longing of common families, and the celebrations of nobles. It reminds us that even the simplest things, a flame, a glow, a scent, were once infused with layers of meaning, with history, with quiet reverence. And so, beeswax stands in history, not only as a material, but as a marker of human experience. It was the light of sanctuaries, the glow of celebrations, the dream of the humble. It connected people to bees, to seasons, to trade, to worship, and to imagination. In its golden flame we glimpse not only the past, but the enduring truth that light, in all its forms, has always carried meaning. It has always been more than brightness. It has been comfort, beauty, and a symbol of something beyond ourselves. When we imagine candle making in centuries past, it is tempting to picture a workshop filled with specialized instruments, rows of neatly arranged molds, and shelves stacked with supplies. But for most households, the reality was far humbler. The tools required for candle making were few, familiar, and modest. They were the everyday companions of the home, pressed into service whenever the time came to turn fat or wax into light. A melting pot rested over the fire, its surface often blackened with soot after years of use. Wooden rods, reeds, or even strong sticks served as supports for dipping wicks, while shallow basins caught the drips of wax or tallow as they cooled and hardened. These implements did not announce themselves with grandeur. They were simple, practical, and enduring, and yet, in their quiet way, they reveal much about the rhythm of ordinary life, where utility shaped beauty and necessity guided craft. Imagine a kitchen hearth in a modest home. At its center is the fire, steady and alive, its warmth spreading into every corner of the room. Suspended above the flames is a pot, darkened by years of use, its rim chipped, its handle worn smooth. This pot has cooked stews, boiled water, and melted fat into tallow. It is not a tool reserved for one task, but a companion in many. To the side, on a simple wooden table, lie sticks or reeds, perhaps gathered from the garden or cut from hedgerow. A family member has shaved them smooth with a knife, ready to hold wicks for dipping. Beside them rests a basin, shallow and plain, meant to catch the drips that fall during the process. None of these objects look extraordinary, and yet together they form the heart of candle making. In their presence, we glimpse the resourcefulness of past households, where common items took on many lives, adapting to whatever work was required. The melting pot was perhaps the most central tool of all. It was usually made of iron or bronze, strong enough to withstand repeated heating over open flames. Over time, it grew blackened, its shape marked by fire. The pot did not remain pristine, but that was never its purpose. Each mark told of meals prepared, fat rendered, wax softened. The household came to know this pot as an extension of the hearth itself, a vessel of transformation. To place fat inside it was to begin a familiar ritual. The pot held not only tallow, but also the promise of light, a connection between the substance of daily meals and the glow that would later guide evening hours. Wooden rods or reeds were equally modest. Families often repurposed what they had. A straight branch cut from a nearby tree could serve, or a piece of wood smoothed by hand. The rods held the wicks, strings of twisted fiber, suspended so they could be dipped into melted tallow again and again. Over time, repeated use smoothed the rods further, as if the steady rhythm of candle making had softened them into something gentler. These rods were not carved with decoration or marked with pride. They were tools of necessity, valued not for appearance but for reliability. Yet to hold one now, centuries later, is to touch the very rhythm of hands long gone. to feel the imprint of lives spent in patient labor. The basin, often made of clay or wood, served quietly in the background. Its task was simple: to catch the drips of tallow or wax that fell as wicks were lifted from the pot. But even here, nothing was wasted. The hardened drips could be gathered and returned to the pot, melted once more, and reshaped. In this cycle of catching and reusing, the basin reflected the careful economy of households where every scrap mattered. It was not just a tool but a reminder of thrift, of patience, of the unwillingness to discard what might still serve. In wealthier homes, or in the workshops of chandlers, molds added another layer of possibility. These molds were often made of tin or brass, shaped into long cylinders. Wicks were threaded through, and melted wax or tallow was poured inside, left to cool into neat, uniform candles. To own such molds was a mark of means, for they required more expense than the humble dipping method. But even here, the tools remained simple in form: straight tubes, plain surfaces, and steady stands. The beauty lay not in ornament, but in the clean lines of their purpose. Tools were not simply objects, they were companions, passed down from generation to generation. A melting pot that had served a grandmother might be used by her daughter and then her granddaughter. Wooden rods, worn smooth, carried the imprint of many hands. These tools bore silent witness to the passing of time, to the seasons of light and shadow, to the persistence of households who shaped their own comfort from the simplest of means. To look upon such tools today, whether in museums or in old collections, is to see not just objects, but the continuity of life, unbroken, steady, and enduring. The simplicity of candle-making equipment reflects a broader truth about daily life in earlier centuries. People relied on modest, multi-purpose tools, adapting them for countless tasks. A knife carved food, cut reeds, and shaped wood. A pot boiled broth, rendered fat, and melted wax. A basin washed clothes, caught drips, and stored grain. Tools were never idle. They shifted roles as needed, becoming part of the rhythm of survival. This modesty of equipment did not diminish life, but enriched it, binding people more closely to their surroundings and teaching them to see usefulness in the most ordinary shapes. To imagine these tools in use is to imagine evenings filled with quiet labor. The fire crackles softly, the melting pot steams with a faint smell of tallow. A child holds a rod steady while a parent dips the wick, pulling it out slowly to let the coating cool before dipping again. The basin catches the drips, which later will be gathered, melted again, and reused. The process is slow, repetitive, and calming. Each dip brings the candle closer to completion. Each tool plays its part, silent and steady. In this way, a household transformed ordinary scraps into the extraordinary gift of light. Museums today preserve some of these simple tools. Behind glass cases rest iron pots, their surfaces scarred with soot, or candle molds lined in neat rows. To modern eyes, they may seem plain, unremarkable, yet their plainness is their story. These are not objects of ornament, but of life itself, shaped by steady hands, worn smooth by years of use. They are reminders of a time when light was not a switch away, but a product of care, patience, and tools passed down through generations. To gaze at them is to step back into the rhythm of those households, to feel the quiet dignity of ordinary craft. The beauty of these tools lies not in decoration, but in endurance. They tell us that history is not only the story of kings, battles, and grand monuments. It is also the story of a soot-blackened pot, a smoothed wooden rod, a shallow basin, objects that lived in kitchens, warmed by firelight, surrounded by voices and footsteps. These tools whisper of lives lived steadily, without drama, yet filled with meaning. They remind us that simplicity has its own kind of grace, born of repetition, care, and necessity. In reflecting on the tools of candlemaking, we also reflect on the values of the people who used them. Resourcefulness, thrift, patience, and continuity, all these are woven into the surfaces of those objects. They tell us that beauty can be found not in grand design, but in quiet function. They tell us that history rests not only in great events, but in the humblest of tools, held in the hands of countless generations who shaped light from darkness. And so, the simple tools of the trade stand as symbols of ordinary households across centuries. They were steady companions, familiar and unassuming, yet essential. With them, families melted fat, dipped wicks, caught drips, and shaped light. With them, generations passed their skills forward, teaching children how to transform scraps into candles. With them, the rhythm of life continued steady, patient, and enduring. These tools may seem small, but they carry the weight of countless evenings, countless flames, countless quiet moments when a room was filled with the soft glow of a candle born from their use. Every candle, no matter how humble or grand, began with a wick. At first glance, it was only a slender string, a length of twisted fiber easily overlooked. But in truth, it was the very heart of the candle, the small but vital bridge between fuel and flame. Without a wick, no pool of tallow or wax could catch fire. Without a wick, no steady light could guide a family through the evening hours. It was this simple cord, spun from flax, hemp, or cotton, that carried the promise of brightness into the shadows. To prepare a wick was not an afterthought, but a deliberate, careful step, one that often rested in the hands of women and children within the household. They twisted fibers together, rolling them between their palms, sometimes braiding lightly to add strength. The work was gentle, repetitive, and filled with patience. In the quiet rhythm of their movements, there was a recognition that even the smallest task could shape the comfort of a night. The materials for wicks were chosen with care, though they were gathered from what the household had at hand. Flax, strong and smooth, often came from fields already planted for linen. Hemp, with its tough fibers, was another option, its coarser strands giving durability. Cotton, rarer in many regions until later centuries, became a favored choice for its softness and steady burning. In each case, the fibers were spun or twisted by hand, forming cords of just the right thickness. Too thin, and the wick would burn away too quickly, extinguishing the flame. Too thick, and the candle would sputter, smoke, and waste its fuel. The balance had to be exact, and so the preparation of wicks became a quiet craft in itself, handed down from one generation to the next. To imagine this process, one might step into the dim light of a medieval kitchen. The hearth glows with a gentle fire, and a mother sits near its warmth, a basket of fibers resting at her side. She draws a small bundle of flax, combed and ready, and begins to roll it carefully between her fingers. A child sits beside her, imitating the motion with shorter strands, learning the skill through repetition. The sound is soft, the faint hiss of the fire, the whisper of fibers twisting together. Each cord, once finished, is coiled neatly and set aside, ready for its later roll. It is a small moment, unremarkable to those who lived it, yet it carried within it the foundation of light. The wick's importance was not always immediately visible, for once the candle was made, the eye naturally turned to the body of tallow or wax. Yet anyone who had ever struggled with a poorly made wick understood its value. A candle with a weak wick would gutter and die, leaving a room in darkness. A wick too thick would produce smoke that stung the eyes and filled the air with a heavy scent of burning fat. But a wick, twisted just right, prepared with skill, would draw the melted fuel upward with perfect steadiness, feeding the flame with quiet grace. The flame would rise clear, bright, and unwavering, lasting through the evening hours with dignity. The difference was small to the eye, but vast in its effect, shaping whether a family sat in comfort or in frustration. There is something almost symbolic about the wick. It was so slight, so easily overlooked, yet it bore the responsibility of carrying light itself. A thread no wider than a reed held the power to transform fat or wax into something luminous. It carried within it the hopes of a household, the ability to read a psalm before bed, to mend a garment after sunset, to sit in gentle conversation without the press of darkness. In that small cord, twisted by hand, lay the difference between fear and safety, silence and fellowship, shadow and light. Preparing wicks was also a task that taught children the value of patience and contribution. Though young hands could not yet manage the heavy pot or the hot wax, they could twist fibers. They could help shape the slender cords that would later hold a flame. In this way, even the smallest members of the household took part in the cycle of making light. It was a lesson in cooperation, a reminder that every hand had a place in the economy of the home. For a child, to see a candle burn with a wick they had helped prepare must have carried a quiet pride. They had taken part in something that reached beyond their own small strength, creating light for the whole family to share. In monasteries, where candles burned daily in chapels and refectories, the preparation of wicks took on a more organized form. Monks might sit together, their fingers moving steadily as they twisted cords from hemp or flax. In the silence of cloisters, the rhythm of this work became a kind of devotion in itself. Each wick, a small offering prepared for the flame that would later illuminate prayers. The monks understood, perhaps more deeply than most, that light was not only a physical comfort, but a symbol of the divine. In their hands, the wick was not just a tool of craft, but a vessel for spiritual meaning. Even in wealthier households, where beeswax candles might replace tallow, the wick remained essential. The finest wax could not burn without it. The golden glow of a beeswax candle, prized for its purity, depended entirely on the small cord hidden at its core. Thus, in every setting, humble cottages, bustling monasteries, grand manors, the wick was the unseen heart of the flame. Its preparation connected all classes, reminding us that behind every light there was first the work of patient hands. When we look at old candle stubs in museums, it is often the body of wax that draws attention. The smooth, pale surface of beeswax, or the rougher texture of tallow, speaks of materials once scarce and valued. But if one looks more closely, there at the center lies the charred thread of a wick, blackened yet still visible. That tiny remnant is a witness to the flame it once carried. It tells us that light does not come from substance alone, but from the meeting of substance and guide, fuel and bridge, matter and spark. In this way, the wick stands as a quiet metaphor for life itself. So often, it is the smallest, most unassuming things that carry the greatest weight. A thread no thicker than a finger made possible the glow that shaped evenings, guarded households, and filled chapels with radiance. To prepare a wick was to prepare a path for light, a humble act with profound consequences. The wick also reveals something about the balance of human life with nature. Flax fields waving in the wind, hemp plants growing tall, cotton gathered from bowls. These were the raw beginnings of light. The plants absorbed the sun, grew strong from earth and water, and then offered their fibers to human hands. From soil to stalk to string, the journey was long and patient, and only after that journey, twisted and prepared, could the wick carry flame. Thus, every candle flame was connected backward through time, rooted in field and harvest, in the care of plants tended season after season. As evening fell in past centuries, when the wick was lit and the candle burned steadily, perhaps families did not stop to think of all this. To them, the candle was simply light. But as we reflect now, we can see the many hidden layers: the soil, the plants, the hands that twisted fibers, the patience of small tasks, the devotion of repetition. The wick held all of this silently, asking for no recognition, giving light without announcement. In remembering the wick, we also remember the rhythm of households shaped by care. Nothing in their lives was wasted, and nothing was too small to matter. Even a cord of twisted fiber could carry the heart of evening. And so, the wick at the heart of every candle becomes more than an object of craft. It becomes a lesson, whispered softly across centuries, reminding us that light begins not with brilliance but with the quiet strength of the smallest thread. Of all the methods by which people made their own light, the dipping of candles by hand was the most familiar, the most widespread, and in many ways the most quietly poetic. It required no elaborate workshop, no grand instruments of metal or stone. Instead, it called only for patience, a warm pot of tallow or wax, a length of wick, and a steady rhythm repeated many times over. The wick, tied to a small rod or reed, would be lowered gently into the vessel of melted fat or wax. For a moment it disappeared into the shimmering liquid, then rose again, glistening, carrying upon its slender cord a thin coat of what would, layer by layer, become a candle. It would then be set aside to cool, only to be dipped once more. Dip after dip, pause after pause, the candle slowly took shape. It was not a task of haste or drama, but of waiting, of patience, of trusting that time itself would build the light. The room in which dipping took place was often a kitchen, or another corner of the home where the hearth fire already burned. A blackened pot would rest above the coals, filled with fat rendered down from meals past, or with beeswax if a household was fortunate. The scent drifted through the air, stronger and more pungent when it was tallow, softer and faintly sweet when it was wax. Children sometimes lingered nearby, watching in silence as their mothers or older siblings repeated the motions again and again. To them it must have seemed like a quiet magic, the way a bare string grew thicker with each careful lowering, becoming something solid, something useful, something that would later banish the very darkness in which they now stood. The process was deceptively simple, but those who practiced it knew that it required a rhythm, a patience that could not be rushed. If the candle was dipped too quickly into the pot, the coating might not cling properly. If the next dip was made before the previous layer had cooled, the wax or tallow would slide away in uneven patches. Each dip, then, had to be followed by a pause just long enough for the layer to set, but not so long that the candle grew brittle or cracked. In these intervals, the hands of the candlemaker might rest upon the table, or they might move to adjust another wick, ready for its turn. The pauses were as much a part of the process as the dipping itself, a reminder that light was born not in haste, but in patience. Over the course of many repetitions, a candle slowly grew. At first, the wick seemed barely changed, its cord darkened and slightly stiffened by its thin coat, but with every dip it gained a little more weight, a little more presence. A dozen dips might produce a candle still slender and fragile, while 50 could bring it to the thickness desired for steady burning. In this way, the final candle was not the result of a single act, but of many small acts repeated faithfully. The household that made its candles in this way learned a quiet lesson in persistence, in the value of small efforts added together across time. The atmosphere of a dipping day was one of gentle busyness. The fire kept the pot warm, sending flickers of light across the walls. The scent of melting fat filled the air, earthy and familiar, the smell of sustenance being put to use once more. In the corner, bundles of prepared wicks waited their turn, laid neatly upon a wooden bench. Perhaps outside the windows, the day shifted slowly from afternoon toward evening, though inside the task went on steadily, almost timelessly. The dip and rise, the cooling, the pause, the dip again, these motions became a rhythm as steady as a lullaby. For those watching or listening, the sound of the rod against the pot, the faint hiss of the wick entering the warm liquid, the soft drip as excess wax fell back into the pot, all combined to form a kind of music, quiet but enduring. It is easy now, in a world of instant light, at the touch of a switch, to forget how much time was once given to these humble tasks. A family that wished to have enough candles for the winter had to set aside whole days for dipping, days in which many hands contributed. Children fetched more fat or wood for the fire, older siblings turned wicks, and mothers or fathers dipped patiently, one after another, until racks of cooling candles hung like pale fruit from wooden rods. Each candle represented not only light, but hours of effort, hours given freely for the comfort of the household. To look upon them was to see not only fuel, but the memory of hands at work, of patient repetition in the glow of the hearth. The difference between tallow and beeswax was felt keenly in this process. Tallow, with its stronger scent and quicker cooling, required frequent attention and often left the candle slightly uneven. Wax, smoother and more forgiving, allowed for cleaner layers, producing candles of gentle sheen and sweet fragrance. Yet in either case, the dipping remained the same, patient, steady, without rush. In the cottages of farmers, in the halls of monasteries, in the workshops of tradesmen, the same slow rhythm could be found. Dip, lift, pause, repeat. Across centuries and across lands, this method bound together countless lives, reminding us that even in different homes, people turned to the same humble craft to secure their light. There was also a communal aspect to the work. In some villages, families might gather together at certain times of the year to prepare their candles for the seasons ahead. They would share pots, rods, and fibers, working side by side in long, steady hours. Conversation might rise and fall as the candles thickened, talk of the harvest, of neighbors, of the weather to come. Yet even without words, there was comfort in the shared rhythm, the knowledge that each household was contributing to the same cycle of light. In this way, dipping candles became not only a task of necessity, but also a quiet ritual of community. When the candles were finally finished, they hung in rows to cool and harden, their pale forms lined up neatly against the wall. To see them gathered together was to feel a sense of abundance, of security against the long nights ahead. Each candle was small, but together they represented warmth, comfort, and safety. They would be lit one by one as evenings drew in, their flames carrying into the dark all the patience, care, and labor that had gone into their making. There is a certain poetry in the act of dipping candles by hand. It is the poetry of slowness, of tasks that cannot be hurried, of patience rewarded only by persistence. The candle itself, when finally lit, embodied this same truth. It burned slowly, hour by hour, giving light in steady measure. Just as its making required time, so too did its use. Nothing about the candle was sudden or rushed. It belonged to a rhythm older and quieter than our own, a rhythm measured by the turning of seasons, by the rising and setting of the sun. by the steady dip and lift of a hand over a pot of melted wax. And so, in remembering the dipping of candles, we remember more than a method of craft. We remember a way of life, in which light was born not from speed, but from patience, not from abundance, but from careful use of what was at hand. We remember families gathered around a hearth, children watching in quiet wonder, and rods heavy with cooling candles lined up for the nights to come. To dip a candle was to shape light itself, to hold in one's hands the promise of comfort in darkness. It was an act both humble and profound, a steady rhythm that echoed the pace of life in centuries past. Once candles had been dipped, once the wicks had been strengthened by patient layers of tallow or wax, the work was not yet complete. The candle was still soft, still fragile, still shaped more by warmth than by its own firmness. To reach its final state, it had to rest. And so, in households across centuries, the next step was not one of action, but of waiting. Candles were carried gently from the hearthside, where pots of melted fat simmered, and where hands had moved in steady rhythm into cooler, quieter corners of the home. There, away from the heat of the fire, they were left to hang. Long rods or wooden beams were pressed into service, supporting the slender cords of wick from which the soft forms dangled. And as they cooled, the faint scent of wax or tallow drifted into the air, filling storerooms and kitchens with the perfume of patient work completed. The sight of cooling candles was a gentle one. Dozens of pale shapes, some thin, some stout, swayed faintly in the currents of air that passed through a door or window. They looked almost like fruit-quiet harvests, not of field or orchard, but of hearth and hand. A draught might stir them into motion, a soft, slow movement that gave the impression of life, as if these quiet objects were breathing, preparing, strengthening for the work that lay ahead. To walk past such a row was to glimpse comfort before it was needed, to see light waiting silently for the moment it would be called upon. The house felt fuller, safer, with them present, as though each unlit candle already guarded against the shadows to come. The cooling itself was as important as any step of the craft. If candles were handled too soon, while their outer layer was still soft, they could bend, warp, or bear the mark of careless fingers. If they cooled unevenly, they might crack, leaving small fissures that would later cause the flame to sputter. Thus, patience extended even into this stage. The household learned to let the candles be, to give them their hours of quiet before they were ready to be stored or used. In this way, candle making taught not only the value of work, but also the value of stillness. Sometimes, the best thing to do was nothing at all, to trust time to finish what human hands had begun. The rooms in which candles cooled were often modest places. A kitchen, its walls darkened by smoke, might have a beam across which rows of cords were tied. A pantry, smelling of grain and dried herbs, might hold a few rods strung with pale shapes. A cellar, damp and cool, could be pressed into service in warmer months, when heat above ground threatened to keep the candles soft for too long. In each of these spaces, ordinary life continued alongside the quiet presence of cooling candles. Bread was baked, vegetables were stored, families walked past, yet in one corner, the pale forms waited silently, changing hour by hour as they grew firmer and more durable. In monasteries and larger households, the scene could be multiplied many times over. Long wooden racks were set aside specifically for the purpose, filling whole storerooms with rows upon rows of cooling light. The effect must have been striking. Hundreds of pale cylinders suspended in stillness, each one destined for altar, refectory, or hall. To step into such a room was to feel both awe and reassurance, for here was abundance, measured not in food or clothing, but in the promise of hours made longer, nights made brighter, prayers made visible through flame. For children, these rooms held a quiet fascination. To them, the candles looked like toys or ornaments, so close and yet untouchable. They might sneak a glance or even reach out, only to be scolded for disturbing the delicate process. The lesson was simple: patience. The candles would be ready in their own time, just as bread must rise before baking, just as cloth must be woven before it could be worn. In this way, the cooling candles were also teachers, silent instructors in the rhythm of life, in the truth that nothing useful was born in haste. The air in these rooms carried its own character. With tallow, the scent was strong, lingering, a reminder of the animals that had given their fat for fuel. It was not always pleasant, but it was familiar, tied to the rhythm of household economy where nothing was wasted. With beeswax, the air was gentler, touched with the faint perfume of honey. To stand among cooling beeswax candles was almost to stand in a garden in bloom. The fragrance soft and sweet, promising a different kind of comfort. The smell alone marked the difference between households of modest means and those of greater wealth, or between domestic work and sacred spaces where wax was reserved for prayer. Time itself seemed to move differently in these places. There was no rush, no clamor, no need for speed. The candles hung quietly, and the people who passed by adjusted themselves to the same slow rhythm. The pause between one stage of making and the next became a kind of meditation, a small reminder that much of life's work is not in doing, but in allowing. Just as the fields required months of sun and rain before harvest, just as children required years of care before adulthood, so too did candles require hours of cooling before their purpose could be fulfilled. It was a lesson woven into daily life, seen not as inconvenience, but as simple truth. When the candles were finally ready, they bore little trace of their fragility. They were firm to the touch, their surfaces smooth, their shapes steady. They could now be tied into bundles, stacked in boxes, or placed in cupboards for later use. But before they reached that stage, they passed through this liminal moment, this quiet interval in which they were neither raw wick nor finished light, but something in between. That in-between space was as essential as any other, for it was in cooling that the candle became strong enough to serve. If one imagines walking through such a room in the evening, when the fire has burned low and the house is settling into silence, the impression is one of peace. The candles hang quietly in their rows, their pale bodies reflecting the last glow of the hearth or the faint silver of moonlight slipping through a shutter. They ask nothing, they demand nothing, they simply are, waiting for their turn to shine. To linger in that space is to feel a calm assurance, as though the house itself were gently preparing for the darkness, holding within it the quiet strength of light to come. In thinking of these rooms now, across centuries, one might see them as more than mere workshops. They were places where time slowed, where work gave way to patience, where the ordinary became quietly sacred. The waiting itself was a ritual, a necessary pause in the cycle of creation. And so, in cooling rooms, we find not only candles hanging in silence, but also a reflection of human life, the need for rest, the strength found in stillness, the quiet assurance that tomorrow's comfort is already being prepared today. As centuries passed, the practice of candle making evolved, reflecting both changes in society and the gradual refinement of domestic crafts. Among the most notable developments was the introduction of mold-simple tools at first, often made of clay or tin, yet carrying within them a quiet revolution in the way candles were shaped. Unlike the slow, rhythmic dipping that built up a candle layer by layer, molding allowed a fuller, more immediate transformation. Liquid wax or tallow, poured carefully into these waiting vessels, cooled into form more quickly and evenly, producing sticks that were smoother, straighter, and more uniform than their hand-dipped cousins. The process was not without its own demands. The melted fat or beeswax had to be prepared with equal patience, strained of impurities and held at just the right temperature so that it would flow evenly into the mold without hardening too soon. Each mold had to be readied, sometimes rubbed lightly with oil or ash to prevent sticking, sometimes cooled to ensure a clean release. Into these hollow shapes, the wick was suspended carefully, held taut so that it remained centered while the warm liquid filled the space around it. Then came the stillness of waiting, as the transformation unfolded within the mold's narrow walls. What emerged, once cooled and gently released, was a candle of pleasing symmetry, its sides smooth, its base even, its body strong and straight, ready for both household use and public sale. The shift to molded candles was more than a technical adjustment. It was a reflection of changing rhythms in human life. In villages and towns, where markets bustled and households demanded steady supplies, efficiency carried weight. The dipping method, though steady and reliable, was slow and dependent upon repetition. A single candle might take hours to reach its full thickness, requiring endless cycles of dipping and cooling. By contrast, the mold provided a shortcut, allowing several candles to be shaped at once. What once took hours could now be achieved more swiftly, and though the process still required care, it answered the growing needs of communities where light was increasingly bound to both commerce and comfort. Workshops appeared where families or guilds turned out dozens, even hundreds, of molded candles, their surfaces bearing the quiet precision of the tool that shaped them. Rows of molds lined shelves and tables, waiting to be filled, their uniformity promising not only efficiency but also predictability, a trait valued by buyers who wished for candles that burned evenly, without surprise. Yet for all this shift toward practicality, the dignity of candle making remained. The act of pouring wax into a mold was no less meaningful than dipping it into a basin, for in both cases, the transformation from liquid to solid held its quiet wonder. To watch molten fat, once part of a living creature, or golden beeswax, once gathered from flowers by countless bees, harden into a smooth cylinder of light, was to witness the ordinary transfigured, whether made by hand or mold. Each candle carried within it the same silent promise, to chase away darkness, to extend the day into evening, to guard against the uncertainty of night. And though molding introduced efficiency, it did not erase the human presence in the craft. Hands still measured, poured, and waited. Hands still released the cooled form, still trimmed the wick, still bundled the finished pieces for storage or trade. Each candle, no matter how uniform, still bore the trace of human patience. In many homes, especially those of modest means, dipped candles continued to hold their place. Molds, after all, required resources: metal, clay, craftsmanship that not every household could afford. But in workshops, monasteries, and towns, the molded candle gained ground. Tin molds were particularly valued, their surfaces allowing for easier release and longer use, while clay molds, more fragile, carried with them the rustic charm of local production. Later, brass and iron would join the list, offering durability for larger-scale work. In each case, the mold was more than a tool. It was a vessel of order, turning the irregularity of melted substance into the clarity of shape. The appearance of molded candles in markets changed the landscape of trade as well. Where once villagers might purchase bundles of dipped candles of varying thickness and length, they now found neat rows of smooth, uniform sticks, each resembling the other so closely that one could measure them against a ruler. This uniformity carried with it a sense of refinement, a step toward the world of standardized goods that would later define entire economies. To the buyer, it meant predictability, a candle that would stand evenly in its holder, that would burn steadily without leaning, that could be counted upon in both ritual and necessity. In churches, the uniform glow of molded candles added to the atmosphere of solemnity, their clean forms lining altars and candelabra with harmonious precision. In homes, the smoothness of a molded candle lent a subtle touch of dignity to evening gatherings, a quiet mark of care that went beyond mere function. Still, molding did not erase the intimacy of candle making. The work of pouring was its own ritual, requiring steady hands and careful timing. Too hot, and the wax might crack as it cooled. Too cool, and it would fail to fill the mold fully, leaving air pockets that weakened the structure. The wick had to be held firmly in place, lest it drift to one side and produce a crooked flame. Releasing the candle from its mold was another delicate moment, as the maker eased it free, hoping for a clean shape unmarred by sticking or breakage. Each successful release brought a small satisfaction, a quiet pride in the craft that had guided fluid into form. And when rows of newly molded candles stood ready, the workshop or home was filled with the same atmosphere of abundance that had long accompanied the cooling of dipped candles, an assurance that light had been secured for the days and nights ahead. The cultural meaning of candles also shifted subtly with this change. Dipped candles, with their layers built over time, carried within them a visible memory of the process, each ripple a mark of patience. Molded candles, by contrast, appeared smooth, unmarked, as though born complete from the mold's embrace. They embodied a different kind of beauty, one that spoke of precision and refinement rather than visible labor. This made them particularly suited to spaces where order and harmony were prized: churches, guild halls, and homes of greater wealth. Yet both forms continued to coexist, reflecting the diversity of human life itself, some shaped by slow repetition, others by efficient casting, yet all destined to shine with the same flame. In reflecting on the rise of molded candles, one cannot help but see in them a mirror of broader human history. As societies grew more complex, as towns swelled and markets widened, so too did the tools of craft adapt. The mold represented not only a technical improvement, but also a philosophical one, the desire for uniformity, efficiency, and yet, within that pursuit, the essence of the candle remained unchanged. It was still a vessel of light, still a bridge between human need and natural resource, still a quiet companion to evenings, prayers, and gatherings. The story of molded candles, then, is not simply a tale of invention, but of continuity. It shows us how human hands, across centuries, have balanced change with tradition, innovation with patience. Even as molds multiplied the speed of production, even as workshops turned out bundles for markets, the candle remained what it had always been, a symbol of comfort, a tool of survival, a touch of beauty in the long hours of night. And so, in later times, when one walked into a room filled with the scent of cooling wax and the sight of smooth, uniform sticks hanging in rows or resting in baskets, one was reminded not only of progress, but also of the timeless bond between light and life, between human effort and the quiet dignity of flame. Candle making, like so many of the quiet crafts that shaped ordinary lives in earlier centuries, was deeply tied to the rhythms of the year. It did not exist in isolation, as some trade detached from field or flock, but was woven directly into the cycle of nature and the labors that accompanied each season. To speak of candles is to speak of autumn harvests, of the summer hum of bees, of winter nights stretching endlessly long, and of spring mornings where the first light seemed to promise freedom from the need for flame. Families did not gather their materials at random. Rather, the entire craft was guided by the ebb and flow of the earth's offerings. In autumn, after fields had yielded their grains and fruits, came the butchering season. Livestock that could not be overwintered was slaughtered, their meat salted or smoked for storage, and their fat carefully saved. Nothing was wasted, for in a household where every scrap mattered, the rendered fat slowly melted into tallow became the foundation of the winter's light. Pots blackened by countless fires simmered with these trimmings, the fat strained and set aside, its strong scent lingering in kitchens and storerooms. Alongside this, in households lucky enough to keep hives, the end of summer brought the careful gathering of beeswax. After the bees had labored tirelessly through the warm months, moving from bloom to bloom, their hives became a source of sweetness and of light. Honey was taken for food, golden and sticky, while the wax was softened and shaped into clean burning candles. These were rare treasures, often reserved for sacred or special use, but the rhythm of their harvest was no less essential. By the time the year turned cold, families had their stores, pots of tallow set aside, bundles of wicks spun and waiting, perhaps a small reserve of beeswax carefully guarded. Winter was the true testing ground for these labors. The nights were long, stretching out in silence after the early fall of dusk, and every candle became a companion in the months when firelight alone was not enough. The hearth could warm and glow, but a candle could be carried, could be set upon a table, could bring its steady pool of light to the place where mending was done, or where children learned their letters, or where a family bowed their heads in evening prayer. Winter burned through the stockpiles of autumn, teaching households the value of thrift and foresight. To squander candles too quickly was to risk long weeks of darkness before the days grew long again. People counted their supplies carefully, trimming wicks to extend burn time, saving the best candles for when their presence mattered most. A beeswax candle might be lit only on feast days, its gentle honeyed scent filling a room with solemnity, while the everyday work of evening hours fell to the humbler, smokier tallow. Even so, there was comfort in the knowledge that these flames, born of the year's labor, would see the family through the deepest dark. Spring brought a change that was not only in the fields and hedgerows, but in the very rhythm of light itself. As the days lengthened, the need for candles eased. Tasks that had required flame in the heart of winter could once again be done by daylight. Farmers rose with the sun, and children played in the lingering evenings. The remaining candles, those not yet consumed, were stored carefully, to be drawn upon when storms rolled in or when an unexpected night's work was required. There was relief in this easing, a gentle lifting of the burden that winter had pressed so heavily upon every household. It was as if the candles themselves could rest, waiting for when they would once again be needed most. Summer, bright and long, often required the least artificial light, but it was also a season of preparation. Beekeepers tended their hives, ensuring that bees had both space and protection to build their combs. In fields, livestock grew fat on pasture, their fates sealed with the turning of autumn, and in homes, people repaired molds, smoothed rods, and spun new lengths of wick, laying quiet foundations for the cycle that would come again. The year's turning made candle making not just a craft but a seasonal rhythm in itself. as natural and predictable as the planting of seeds or the gathering of grain. A candle was never simply an object plucked from a shelf or a box. It was the culmination of time, of patience, of the turning of earth and sky. Each one was a fragment of a year's story: the summer's buzzing labor of bees, the autumn's heavy labors of harvest and slaughter, the winter's long consumption of stores, and the spring's relief at the sun's return. To burn a candle was to touch all these seasons at once, to be reminded that light did not arrive without labor, and that every flicker carried within it the work of hands and the bounty of nature. Communities understood this deeply, for in earlier centuries, survival itself depended on walking in rhythm with the earth. Candle making was just one of many crafts that mirrored this truth, but it was among the most intimate, for its fruits were consumed not in fields or markets, but in the quiet of evening, in the stillness of rooms where families gathered. Even festivals and traditions reflected these rhythms. In autumn, as harvests were gathered and nights began to lengthen, candles often marked moments of thanksgiving, their flames a symbol of abundance carried into the dark half of the year. In midwinter, festivals of light, whether religious feasts or local customs, leaned heavily on the burning of candles, their glow a defiance of the season's gloom. By spring, candlelight was sometimes carried in processions, marking renewal, the return of warmth, and the triumph of light over dark. Each ritual echoed the same truth, that the small flame of a candle was more than a practical tool. It was a symbol of humanity's place in the eternal turning of seasons. Thus, to understand the seasonal rhythms of candle making is to glimpse the heartbeat of older households, where time was measured not by clocks but by cycles, and where even the humblest stick of tallow or beeswax was woven into the pattern of survival. In autumn, hands worked to gather. In winter, they rationed and consumed. In spring, they stretched what remained. In summer, they prepared for the next round. Year after year, this cycle continued, as dependable as the sun and moon, as necessary as breath. And in each flame that burned, there was both a memory of seasons past and a quiet promise of seasons yet to come. Within the walls of churches, monasteries, and chapels, the candle found its highest meaning. In ordinary homes it was a tool, a necessity against the length of night. But in sacred spaces it became a symbol, a presence that reached beyond mere practicality. The glow of a candle was never just light. It was prayer made visible, a flame carrying whispers of devotion upward, bridging the fragile human world with the unseen. To step into a medieval church on a winter evening was to enter a world defined by this quiet glow. Stone walls, cool and echoing, caught the golden shimmer of beeswax tapers, their flames rising in unison, steady but alive, trembling only slightly in the drafts that moved through high arches. These lights transformed cold architecture into something warm and living, softening edges, breaking shadows, making even the largest nave feel intimate. People came to these spaces not only for ritual but for refuge, and the presence of candlelight created the atmosphere that invited contemplation. Each flame represented a soul's hope. Each cluster on an altar spoke of community gathered together in faith. In monasteries, the rhythm of the hours was measured by both voice and flame. Monks rose in the dark, sometimes when the night was at its deepest, and walked silently into the choir stalls where candles already waited. The light guided their steps, flickering gently upon polished wood and carved stone, illuminating the pages of worn psalters. In these early hours, before dawn had yet to suggest its return, the candle was more than practical. It was companionship, a steady reminder that darkness was never absolute. Prayers rose in chant, and the flames seemed to echo the words, each flicker like a syllable in the language of light. For worshippers, the symbolism was profound. A candle consumed itself slowly, giving away its body of wax in order to create brightness. And in this act, people saw a reflection of sacrifice, of offering, of devotion that asked for nothing in return. In Catholic tradition especially, beeswax was associated with purity. Its origin in the work of bees, linking it with natural order and divine providence. To light a beeswax candle upon an altar was not just to illuminate space, but to honor the sacred itself. The fragrance of wax and faint honey filled chapels, mingling with incense, creating a sensory world where earth and heaven seemed closer. The placement of candles within sacred spaces also carried meaning. On altars, they framed the central mysteries, guiding eyes toward chalice and host, cross and scripture. Their symmetrical glow lent balance, suggesting harmony between human order and divine truth. Inside chapels and shrines, votive candles offered worshippers a chance to leave behind a piece of themselves. A small flame, lit by a trembling hand, might burn long after the person had departed, carrying their prayer forward in time. Such gestures made the candle a vessel for continuity, a companion in absence. One could imagine countless prayers whispered into the flicker of countless flames, each one a private hope folded into the larger hush of sacred walls. The candle also shaped time in ways subtle but profound. In monasteries, as hours of prayer passed, candles were trimmed or replaced, their steady burn marking the slow procession of day and night. In great cathedrals, feast days demanded extraordinary displays, hundreds of tapers lit together until the entire building seemed washed in gold. The sight must have been overwhelming, a sea of small flames combining into radiance that seemed to erase the boundaries between shadow and light. People saw in it a glimpse of the eternal, a vision of heaven's brightness reflected in fragile earthly fire. Yet even in smaller parish churches, a few humble candles could achieve the same sense of awe, reminding congregants that holiness required no grandeur, only presence. Candles were also woven into the great cycles of the liturgical year. At Easter, the Paschal candle, large and tall, was lit to symbolize resurrection and new light breaking into the world. Its flame, drawn from newly kindled fire, was shared among smaller candles carried by the faithful, spreading brightness hand to hand until the entire congregation glowed with shared illumination. At Candlemas, the blessing of candles marked not just ritual but the recognition of light's role in human survival, acknowledging the long winter yet also its eventual passing. At funerals, candles accompanied the body, their flames standing watch, reminding the living that the soul too moved toward a different light. In all these moments, the candle was never silent decoration but participant, embodying meaning through its very act of burning. One might pause to imagine the sensory world of these sacred spaces. The air, cool and faintly damp from stone walls, carried the sweetness of beeswax and the deeper smoke of incense. The sound of chant or prayer drifted through, softened by the warm shimmer of flame. Shadows moved gently, never vanishing but always softened, as if the light preferred not to banish darkness entirely but to embrace it, to weave together the seen and unseen. For worshippers, this atmosphere was transformative. Entering from the bright confusion of market or field, they stepped into a place where time slowed, where the presence of light spoke more than words could manage. It was not drama that they sought here, but stillness, and the candle gave it to them. Even in private devotion, the role of candles was central. In households wealthy enough to afford beeswax, small domestic altars glowed with a taper lit during prayers. The flame's movement echoed the tremor of the human heart, its rise and fall like breath, creating a sense of intimacy between soul and divine. For the poor, even a tallow candle lit for prayer carried the same meaning, proving that the sacred was not restricted by wealth, but accessible wherever flame was tended with reverence. Across Europe, from grand cathedrals to village chapels, from monastic cloisters to small cottages, the candle became the common thread, binding together countless acts of faith. What is striking, when we look back, is how much of this sacred use was about more than necessity. Candles were not chosen simply because no other light was available. They were chosen because their very nature invited symbolism. The flame's fragility mirrored human life, easily extinguished yet beautiful while it endured. Its upward reach suggested longing, the soul stretching toward something beyond itself. Its steady warmth gave comfort. Its glow offered guidance. The candle taught lessons wordlessly. Lessons absorbed not only by theologians but by farmers, merchants, children, anyone who had watched a flame and felt its quiet pull. And so, within sacred spaces, candles carried humanity's deepest longings, made visible in flicker and glow. They transformed stone into sanctuary, silence into presence, darkness into reflection. To think of them now is to remember that faith was not only written in words or sung in hymns, but was lived through the quiet companionship of light. In their humble flames, people of earlier centuries found strength, found beauty, found a bridge between the everyday and the eternal. And as each candle gave itself away, hour by hour, it left behind not emptiness but memory, a reminder that even the smallest light can hold meaning beyond measure. In the ordinary household of centuries past, evening was not a sudden event marked by the switch of a lamp or the hum of electric light, but a slow descent into shadow. As the sun lowered behind fields or rooftops, rooms dimmed little by little until only the hearth's glow remained. It was then that the ritual of the candle began, small and steady, but deeply significant. Lighting a candle was never a casual act. It marked the transition from the labor of day to the rest of night. Flint struck steel, a spark caught on tinder, and with patient coaxing, the wick drew flame. To see that first point of light take hold was to feel the atmosphere of the home shift, as though the flame itself whispered that the day's tasks were done, that rest was near, that comfort had arrived. A single taper on the table might cast its glow across bowls of simple supper bread, broth, perhaps a piece of meat saved from the week's provisions, while another candle, set upon a small stool or chest, gave comfort in the sleeping chamber. These flames were not merely functional, they were companions, presiding quietly over the most intimate rhythms of family life. Around the dinner table, families gathered close, leaning into the small circle of illumination. Shadows stretched long across plaster or timber walls, dancing gently with the flame's movement. Conversation was hushed, not always because of weariness, but because the candle's presence itself seemed to encourage stillness. In these hours, when the outside world had gone dark and silent, the family turned inward, weaving bonds of familiarity in the glow. Children listened to the soft murmur of their parents' voices, learning rhythms of speech, stories of kin, verses of prayer, or lessons meant to guide them in years ahead. The candle was witness to these moments, reflecting its quiet light on every face, softening features, making even the stern look gentle, the tired look peaceful. Supper by candlelight was not luxury, but necessity, and yet it had all the tenderness of ritual, repeated night after night, until it became woven into memory itself. After meals, the candle might be carried carefully from one room to another. Its flame had to be protected from sudden drafts, cupped by a hand or shielded with a horn lantern. To extinguish and relight it was a small trouble. So often it traveled with the family, moving with them as the evening unfolded. Perhaps it was set near the hearth, where mending was done, needle and thread guided by its glow. Perhaps it illuminated the pages of a prayer book, letters traced out slowly by a child learning to read. Perhaps it simply sat in the corner of the room where a mother rocked her infant to sleep, its glow steady against the rhythm of her lullaby. In each of these tasks, the candle became more than light. It became part of the household's pulse, keeping company with hands and voices as the hours slipped quietly by. The act of lighting a candle before bed carried its own tender meaning. In many homes there were no large chambers, only shared spaces where pallets of straw or simple beds were laid out side by side. Yet even here, the ritual of the candle was observed. One taper might be set on a stool to cast its comfort into the corners of the room, driving back the deepest shadows until eyes grew heavy. Children found reassurance in that glow, knowing they were not swallowed by darkness, that a steady companion burned quietly beside them. For adults, the flame was both practical and symbolic. It allowed the last tasks to be done before sleeper, laying out of clothes, the checking of locks, the final tending of the hearth. But it also signaled the nearness of rest, the moment when the burdens of the day could finally be put aside. To snuff the candle at last was not just to end its light, but to release oneself into the deeper stillness of night, trusting that the flame would return when morning or necessity called. These small rituals, repeated across generations, gave shape to the ordinary evenings of countless households, in towns and villages, cottages and manor houses alike. The scene was much the same, one or two flames standing guard against night, drawing the family into their circle, setting a rhythm that divided work from rest, daylight from dreams. The candle was not extravagant, not reserved for festivals or churches, but ordinary, steady, humble. Yet it was precisely in this ordinariness that it found its power. It was the constant thread woven through daily life, the quiet mark of transition that reminded people they were safe within their walls, gathered together against the vast dark beyond. The flame also carried a sense of fragility that deepened its meaning. A sudden gust, a careless movement, a slip of wax could extinguish it. Everyone understood how easily darkness could return. Thus, each lighting carried with it a sense of gratitude, a recognition of the gift that even one candle represented. In poorer homes, where candles were few, the family might ration their use, lighting one only when absolutely necessary. In wealthier ones, several might be lit at once, softening the entire room. Yet the ritual was shared across class, uniting rich and poor in the same quiet gesture of evening. No matter the number, Each flame carried significance, each one marking the passage of day into night with dignity. To imagine these evenings now is to glimpse a world slower and gentler than our own. The absence of electric light meant that people lived closer to the rhythm of sun and shadow, and the candle was the mediator between the two. Its circle of glow was small, but it was enough. Enough to eat by, enough to speak by, enough to pray by, enough to close the day in peace. The simple act of lighting, carrying, and extinguishing a candle shaped the very texture of evening life, embedding itself so deeply into memory that even now, centuries later, the image of a flickering flame still carries connotations of home, of quiet, of rest. The story of the candle was never only about light, it was also about the air it shaped, the subtle fragrances and drifting fumes that filled the spaces of medieval and early modern homes. When a tallow candle was lit, its presence was known not only by sight but by smell. Tallow, rendered from animal fat, carried with it the earthy traces of the beasts from which it came: oxen, sheep, pig, escritures, whose lives sustained human households in countless ways. The candle bore their final echo in its flame, and with that echo came an odor that was thick, greasy, and sometimes unpleasant. To modern noses, unaccustomed to such scents, it might seem overpowering, but to those who lived daily with hearth smoke, boiling stews, and barns close at hand, the smell of burning tallow folded naturally into the atmosphere of life. Kitchens were already heavy with the mingling of meat, herbs, smoke, and damp wood. The candle merely added its own note to the familiar chorus. Evening meals, eaten by its light, were accompanied by the scent of the very same animals whose fat gave brightness to the room, a reminder of how nothing in the household economy was wasted. The fragrance of tallow was not one of luxury, yet it was one of intimacy, linking the labor of butchering, rendering, and storing with the comfort of a warm glow at night. Children growing up in such households carried the memory of that mingled center of waxy smoke and hearth fire as part of their understanding of home, the way one recalls the creak of familiar stairs or the sound of a parent's voice. By contrast, beeswax offered a different world entirely. When a beeswax candle was lit, its flame burned with a clarity and steadiness unmatched by tallow, and the air around it carried the faint sweetness of honey. This was not merely a practical difference but a sensory transformation. To enter a church where dozens of beeswax tapers burned at once was to step into an atmosphere infused with golden light and soft perfume. The stone walls themselves seemed to drink in the glow, while the faint fragrance elevated the senses toward reverence. In wealthy households where beeswax was afforded, the difference was immediate. Rooms were not filled with heavy, greasy fumes, but with a delicate sweetness that seemed to refine the very act of gathering. The absence of smoke that blackened rafters or stained plaster was itself a mark of distinction. Where tallow candles left smudges, beeswax left only memory. The air remained clearer, the linens and hangings less soiled, and the atmosphere one of quiet luxury. Thus, scent and smoke became a quiet line of division between classes, marking the difference not in clothing or speech alone, but in the very air one breathed after dusk. Yet even in the humblest cottage, the candle, whether pungent tallow or fragrant wax, was welcomed as steadfast companion. The smell of burning fat might cling to walls and garments, but it was bound up with warmth, nourishment, and light. Families did not recoil from it, but accepted it as part of the fabric of their days. The candle was woven into rituals, prayers said at nightfall, meals eaten together, letters read aloud, mending done by hand. Each of these acts was shaded by the particular scent of the flame that made them possible. Over time, what might seem an inconvenience became instead an association of comfort. The smell of tallow, though coarse, reminded one of safety indoors while winds howled outside. The sweetness of beeswax, though rare, carried an aura of sanctity and festivity, recalling weddings, feast days, or the stillness of chapels. Scent and smoke, in this way, were not accidents of candlelight, but essential to its meaning. To walk through a medieval town after dusk was to encounter this truth in the very air. The lanes might be filled with drifting wood smoke from hearths, but here and there, the sharper tang of tallow-burning wood spilled from open shutters or door cracks. The homes of wealthier merchants or clergy, by contrast, sent forth a subtler trace of beeswax, a perfume almost lost in the mingling odors of animals, mud, and market refuse, yet distinct enough to catch the attention of a passerby. Thus, even in the streets, one could tell something of the lives within by the fragrance of their light. And in monasteries, where dozens of wax tapers burned each night, the sweetness seemed to pour out into cloisters, mingling with the scent of old books, damp stone, and worn wool robes. The air itself testified to the kind of life sustained there, devoted, elevated, ordered by hours of prayer beneath the glow of flames that smoked little and burned clear. Smoke, too, carried meaning beyond mere inconvenience. The curling plume from a tallow candle might sting the eyes or leave soot upon beams, but it also created a visible connection between earth and sky, between wick and roof, between labor and atmosphere. To watch smoke drift was to see time itself passing, minute by minute, curl by curl. In poor homes where every candle had to be carefully rationed, watching the smoke rise after extinguishing the flame was a reminder of what had been spent and what must be saved for tomorrow. In chapels where candles burned in abundance, smoke became part of ritual, rising like prayer itself toward the vaulted ceilings, a visible offering in the dim air. Thus, scent and smoke were never neutral. They shaped the way people experienced light and life. Children remembered them as part of bedtime rituals, the candle by the bed burning down with its unmistakable fragrance lingering even after sleep claimed them. Adults knew them as part of labor, reading accounts or sewing garments with noses accustomed to their presence. Communities knew them as part of worship, associating beeswax with reverence and tallow with necessity. And altogether, society understood them as silent markers of wealth, devotion, and daily rhythm. In this way, the memory of evenings past was not only visual, the flickering glow on walls, the long shadows stretching across rooms, but also olfactory. For centuries, homes bore the mingled scents of tallow, beeswax, hearthfire, and food, and these became inseparable from the very idea of evening. To recall the glow of a candle was also to recall its perfume, whether pungent or sweet, whether earthly or refined. The nose remembered as vividly as the eyes, and so, though humble in appearance, every candle carried with it a world of atmosphere, shaping not just sight but breath, not just illumination but memory. In every age before electric light, the usefulness of a candle was guided as much by what held it as by the wax and wick themselves. A candle without a steady stand risked falling, wasting precious fuel, or, worse, setting fire to straw, cloth, or timber. Thus, the story of candle holders is as important as the candle itself, for together they shaped the quiet glow of evening life. In the simplest cottages, a holder might be no more than an iron spike driven into a block of wood, its surface blackened from years of use. The candle was pressed down upon the point until it sat firm, ready to burn without tipping. In other homes, a clay base, molded by hand, performed the same task, its surface rough but steady, its weight enough to balance the flame. In wealthier households, the holders took on forms of beauty as well as function. Brass gleamed warmly in firelight, pewter caught the candle's glow in its polished surface, and sometimes silver, though rare, lent a quiet dignity to the scene. To see such holders upon a table was to glimpse not only light but status, for their presence marked the household's means as clearly as the number of candles themselves. Some holders were plain rods with wide feet, others had delicate trays beneath the candle to catch drips of wax. This small detail mattered greatly, for wax and tallow were never to be wasted. In humble cottages, the cool drippings would be gathered, melted once more, and shaped into new candles. In larger homes, even when resources were more abundant, the tray served its purpose of neatness, sparing the table from hardened pools that were difficult to scrape away. The forms varied widely, yet each was designed with the same goal: to give the flame a steady home, and to preserve what was too valuable to lose. Some candle holders were made to be carried, with handles shaped into loops or rings so that the flame could travel safely from one room to another. Picture a father climbing a creaking stair, his hand steady on the iron rail, the other gripping a brass holder whose flame guided him upward. Picture a mother carrying a small clay lamp into the loft where her children lay, setting it gently on a stool to give them comfort through the long night. These were not grand gestures, but quiet, necessary ones, repeated daily until they became a rhythm of life itself. In monasteries, holders often stood tall and slender, raising the flame to cast light over pages of scripture. Their design reflected both function and reverence, for the flame was seen not only as brightness for the eyes, but also as a symbol for the soul. In chapels and churches, great stands of iron branched outward like trees, bearing many candles at once. the wax that dripped upon their trays gathered in heavy pools, sometimes hardened into strange shapes that clung for months or years. Silent testimony to prayers whispered beneath their glow. Even here, the stand carried dignity. Without it, the candle would topple, but with it, the flame could rise, steady and pure. The making of candle holders was a craft in itself. Blacksmiths forged iron spikes and stands, hammering them upon anvils with steady rhythm, shaping curves and points with practiced ease. Potters shaped clay bases, leaving fingerprints still visible on their surfaces centuries later. Carpenters carved wooden stands, sometimes plain, sometimes adorned with simple patterns of line and leaf. And in towns where wealth permitted, metal workers polished brass until it shone, or molded pewter into smooth, elegant forms. To hold one of these objects today, in a museum or an old house, is to feel the weight of ordinary evenings long past, for their surfaces are worn smooth by countless hands that placed, carried, and adjusted them in the half-light of history. The candle holder was not only an object of utility, but also of intimacy. Its shape determined how light moved through the room, whether a flame stood tall upon a table, glowed low beside a bed, or swung gently from a handle as it moved down a hallway. Its material changed the way the flame was perceived. Iron made the glow seem humble and workmanlike. Clay gave it an earthy warmth. Brass and pewter reflected and doubled the light, amplifying it into something softer, more golden. Even the sound of wax dripping onto metal or clay became part of the atmosphere of the evening, a small detail folded into the memory of night. To imagine these holders is to imagine the lives around them. In a peasant's cottage, the iron spike might sit in the center of the table where a family ate their bread and porridge, its flame bright enough for all to share. In the chamber of a merchant, polished brass might gleam beside ledgers and parchments, allowing calculations to continue past dusk. In the bedchamber of a manor, silver holders might stand in pairs, their flames mirrored against polished mirrors, doubling the sense of warmth and wealth. Yet in all cases, the purpose remained the same: to hold the flame steady, to make light possible, to shape the small circle of brightness that pushed back the long hours of night. Even today, when we place a candle in a holder, whether simple or ornate, we echo the gestures of countless generations. We steady the flame, we prevent the drip, we set light into its proper place. The objects may have changed in material and style, but their meaning has not. They remind us that in history, as in life, it is often the small supports, the unnoticed stands, the quiet tools that make possible the things we treasure most. Together, candle and holder shaped not only the glow that filled evenings, but also the memory of those evenings, embedding themselves into the rhythm of daily life in a way so natural that few stopped to reflect on it. Yet without the holder, the candle could not serve. Without the candle, the holder had no purpose. They were companions, silent and steady, keeping company with the generations who leaned into their glow. And so, to remember candle holders is to remember more than objects of metal, clay, or wood. It is to recall evenings long ago, when a single flame steadied in its stand, drew families close, softened voices, cast shadows upon walls, and gave the night its gentlest shape. It is to honor the small details that turned necessity into ritual, function into comfort, and light into memory. In the towns and villages of earlier centuries, not every household prepared its own supply of candles. While rural families often saved scraps of fat or tended a few hives to make their own tallow or beeswax tapers, many people, especially in growing towns, turned to the craftsman whose entire trade revolved around the making and selling of candles. A chandler's shop was a modest place, often tucked along a narrow street where cobblestones glistened with rain and the scent of smoke drifted from nearby hearths. To step inside was to enter a space filled with the distinct fragrance of wax, both earthy and faintly sweet. The air was warm, touched by the heat of melting pots that had blackened the beams above. Along the walls and shelves, rows of candles hung in neat bundles, pale and uniform, their surfaces smooth from careful dipping or molded into regular shapes. Some were tied with simple string, bundled in counts that made sense to the rhythm of household life, a dozen for a fortnight. More for the winter months when nights stretched long. Customers arrived with coins, or sometimes with goods for barter, a sack of grain, a piece of cloth, a measure of oil, all traded for the light that would carry them through the weeks ahead. In this way, the candle trade connected the countryside and the town, binding together the resources of fields and flocks with the rhythms of market stalls and urban households. The chandler stood in the middle of this quiet network, neither grand merchant nor humble farmer, but someone whose work gave form to one of life's simplest yet most necessary comforts. The workshop itself was often part of the seller's home. A ground floor might serve as the shopfront, with the family living above or behind. Through an open doorway, one might glimpse the tools of the trade, great iron pots resting over brick hearths, ladles for pouring, rods for dipping, and molds stacked carefully on benches. The walls bore the marks of years of use, with patches darkened by smoke and speckled with wax that had splattered in the course of steady work. Children of the household sometimes assisted, cutting wicks or tying finished candles into bundles, their small hands becoming part of the rhythm that kept the business alive. The atmosphere was not rushed, for candle making was always a slow craft, but steady, with one task following another until the shelves were stocked once more. Buyers entered not into grandeur but into familiarity. They knew the smell, the warmth, the slightly sticky feel of wax underfoot. This ordinariness made the chandler's shop a part of community life, a place people visited regularly, as essential as the baker or the miller. The exchange itself was simple yet meaningful. A woman might arrive with her basket, greeting the chandler with quiet words. She would point to a bundle, perhaps ask about the price, perhaps trade a measure of grain instead of coin. The chandler, weighing fairness with practicality, would agree, and soon the candles would be tucked into her basket, resting alongside food or fabric purchased elsewhere in the market. These small transactions were the heartbeat of the town, each one unremarkable in its moment, yet vital to the continuity of daily life. Without them, households would sit in darkness. With them, evenings unfolded in light. In this sense, the candle was more than a commodity. It was a thread in the fabric of the community, woven through with the simple trust between maker and buyer, seller and neighbor. Markets gave life to this trade in their own way. On market days, chandlers sometimes set up stalls, their tables laden with freshly made stock. The scene was lively, filled with the hum of voices, the clatter of carts, the cries of other sellers hawking bread, fish, cloth, or pottery. Yet the chandler's stall carried its own quiet appeal, for amidst the busyness of exchange, there was something steady about bundles of light. People paused, selected, and paid, their faces reflecting a small sense of relief that the darkness of coming nights was accounted for. The candles might be tucked into sacks, wrapped in cloth, or carried carefully by hand, but however they left, they carried with them the assurance of brightness, the promise that after sunset, the home would not fall silent into blackness. This modest comfort mattered deeply, especially in the depths of winter, when the sun set early and rose late. To walk away from the market with a bundle of candles was to walk away with peace of mind. The chandler's trade also connected with broader networks of economy. Tallow often came from local butchers, its rendering a practical use for what might otherwise be wasted. Beeswax, rarer and more precious, traveled through more complex paths, sometimes reaching urban shops through the hands of beekeepers or merchants who collected it from rural apiaries. In port towns, imported waxes and oils occasionally found their way into workshops, adding variety to the stock. Thus, even in something as humble as a candle, one could glimpse the weaving together of local and regional life, the way markets bound distant efforts into one shared fabric of necessity. The flame in a cottage might owe its existence to a butcher's knife, a beekeeper's hive, a chandler's steady hand, and a market's quiet exchanges. All these small laborers folded into the glow of a single taper. In wealthier quarters of town, chandlers sometimes specialized, offering beeswax candles molded with precision, their surfaces smooth, their scent faintly sweet with honey. These were sold at higher prices, often destined for churches, guildhalls, or households that could afford them. In contrast, the more common tallow tapers lined most stalls, their smell strong, their texture less refined, yet their cost within reach of the many. This quiet division reflected the larger structure of society, where light itself became a marker of wealth and status. Still, whether tallow or wax, the candle was purchased with equal care, for in both cases, it was a companion against the dark, and in both cases, it carried the same fragile, flickering flame. To walk through a town at dusk was to see the results of this trade come to life. Windows glowed faintly as families lit their candles, the light spilling into the street in soft golden patches. A passerby might look up and see silhouettes moving against the glow, shadows leaning close to one another, hands working or folding, faces soft with evening calm. All of this, the glow, the shadows, the warmth, was made possible by the chandler's craft and by the quiet exchanges of the market. It was a reminder that even the simplest object, born of ordinary trade, could shape the rhythm of community life in ways both practical and poetic. When we think of these markets now, they might seem small compared to the scale of modern commerce, yet their significance lay not in size but in intimacy. Each candle sold carried with it the labor of the maker, the trust of the buyer, the continuity of tradition. The chandlers did not merely provide goods, they provided reassurance, stability, and a thread of connection in a world that moved by the measure of daylight and flame. Their shop smelled of wax and smoke, their shelves lined with pale bundles, their counters worn smooth by years of exchange. To enter was to step into the heartbeat of community, to participate in a rhythm as old as memory itself. Thus, the story of candle sellers is the story of more than trade. It is the story of how ordinary people secured comfort, how markets stitched together the labors of many, and how even the humblest object became part of the fabric of communal life. The chandler's stalls and shops may no longer stand, their tools long set aside, yet the memory of their work endures in the glow we still associate with comfort, safety, and home. To light a candle even now is to echo those countless evenings when someone left a market with a small bundle tied with string, carrying light back through the narrow streets, carrying home the simple promise of brightness against the waiting dark. Though modern life has filled every corner with swift and effortless illumination, the quiet legacy of handmade light lingers, a memory woven into the long fabric of human history. It calls us back to a time when a flame was not taken for granted but coaxed with patience, when evening began not with the flick of a switch but with the striking of flint, the catching of spark, and the slow blooming of fire upon a wick. In those hours, households lived by gentler rhythms, their sense of time guided not by clocks glowing in blue light, but by the steady burning of tallow or beeswax. To think of handmade candles is to think of a world in which brightness itself felt precious, where one flame stood not only as light, but as reassurance, warmth, and continuity. The craft of shaping fat or wax into tapers was never only a task of necessity. It was also a quiet art, a ritual of resourcefulness that defined domestic life for centuries. In every culture where candles were used, they carried with them an unspoken dignity, humble in form, yet profound in their meaning, bridging the distance between survival and comfort. And even as technology has raced forward, scattering neon across streets and lead across ceilings, the candle still speaks in its soft voice, reminding us of a tradition that endured for generations upon generations. A tradition that lives not only in museums or memory, but also in every home where a single wick is lit for calm, for ceremony, or for simple reflection. The legacy is not only historical but deeply human, for it captures the ways people shaped their nights, nurtured their bonds, and gave beauty to the ordinary through the tender light of handmade flame. This legacy is measured not only in the physical act of making candles, but also in the atmosphere they created. A handmade candle did more than drive away darkness. It shaped the very character of night. Shadows stretched long across plaster walls, dancing gently with each stir of the flame, reminding those who watched that light was alive, fragile, and in need of care. A child might fall asleep under that glow, the soft scent of tallow or beeswax mingling with the comfort of blankets and the murmur of voices. Parents spoke in lowered tones, their faces catching the golden reflection, their gestures slowed by the stillness of the hour. Work ended not with haste, but with transition, as the household gathered in the glow that was both ordinary and sacred. In such scenes, the candle was not merely an object. It was a companion, a witness to laughter, prayer, quiet sorrow, and steady resilience. That is why the memory of handmade light endures so powerfully, because it was woven into the most intimate corners of daily existence, into meals, into conversations, into rituals of faith, and into the silence of rest. The patience of candlemaking itself became part of its legacy, rendering fat, straining tallow, preparing wicks, and dipping one taper after another required hours of quiet labor. A household might spend a whole afternoon replenishing its store. The rhythm of dipping and cooling, repeated until the bundle was complete. Such work carried no glamour, yet it trained the hands in endurance and taught the spirit to value gradual progress. Children grew up watching this steady labor, learning that light was not something that arrived instantly, but but something earned through effort, preserved with care, and respected in its fragility. To burn a handmade candle wastefully would have seemed careless, even disrespectful, for each flame represented hours of gathering, melting, pouring, and waiting. The legacy, then, is one of reverence for what is easily overlooked, the ordinary task made extraordinary by its necessity and its gift of comfort. There is also the memory of resourcefulness. In poorer households, every scrap of fat was saved, nothing wasted, every shred considered fuel for light. A sheep slaughtered for meat also gave its tallow. Bees kept for honey yielded wax that could serve both table and altar. Candle making was a lesson in turning what was available into what was essential, a practice that taught families to live within their means while still shaping beauty from necessity. Wealthier homes, with their brass holders and honey-scented beeswax, reflected the same principle on a different scale. Light was still valued, still respected, even when it came dressed in refinement. Across the spectrum of society, the candle's legacy was not only brightness, but also the wisdom of making the most of what one had. Even in modern times, when electricity hums unseen through wires and bulbs, scatter light without effort, this legacy can still be felt. People continue to turn to candles not because they need them, but because they seek what they represent: calmness, stillness, and a sense of connection to something older than themselves. A single flame on a dinner table, a row of tapers in a chapel, or a candle lit in remembrance of someone gone. All of these acts echo the ancient rhythm of handmade light. The fragile flame offers not only visibility, but also presence, reminding us of continuity, of lives lived in the glow of something so simple, yet so enduring. This continuity forms part of the candle's quiet dignity, for it links past and present in a way no other object of daily life quite can. To imagine those nights long ago is to step into a world where darkness was not banished but softened, where the edges of rooms blurred into shadow, and where light itself carried weight and meaning. In the modest glow of a single taper, people felt not only safety but intimacy. Families gathered close because the circle of light was small, and within that circle bonds were strengthened. Words spoken under candlelight seemed more tender, gestures more deliberate, silence more comfortable. That atmosphere cannot be replicated by the steady hum of electric bulbs, for it was born from scarcity and nurtured by appreciation. It is this atmosphere, this sense of gentleness and attentiveness, that lingers in memory and grants handmade candles their lasting legacy. One could even say that handmade light preserved a different pace of living. Without instant brightness, people measured evenings by flame, adjusting tasks to its limits, letting work conclude earlier, letting rest claim its rightful place. Candles encouraged reflection because they could not flood a room with brightness. Instead, they created islands of light within seas of shadow, inviting people to pause, to gather, to speak quietly, or simply to sit. In that slower rhythm, the day found balance. And so, when we light a candle even now, we unconsciously return to that gentler pace, finding comfort in the way its glow resists hurry, urging us to breathe, to notice, to dwell in the present moment. Thus, the quiet legacy of handmade light lies not only in the objects themselves, but in the habits, attitudes, and values they shaped. They remind us of patience, of resourcefulness, of intimacy, of reverence for what sustains us. They teach us that light, once hard-won, is never trivial, and that even the humblest flame can transform the character of a night. The centuries in which candles were made and burned may have passed, but their influence endures, shaping how we still think of light as more than mere utility. A candle is a reminder that brightness can carry meaning, that it can embody care, tradition, and quiet dignity. And so, in every home where one is lit, the handmade past flickers alive once more, softening shadows, steadying hearts, and reminding us of the centuries in which people lived by slower rhythms and carried light with gratitude. This, above all, is the legacy handmade candles have left us, a sense that light is not simply functional but deeply human, part of the way we have always sought warmth, security, and continuity. Even as technology continues to change the ways we live, the candle remains a bridge to that gentler world, carrying within its flame the memory of countless evenings shaped by modest glow. And in that memory lies its enduring power, an ordinary object that became extraordinary through the lives it touched, the hours it brightened, and the traditions it carried into the present. To step back from these pages, after wandering slowly through the quiet art of handmade candles, is to feel as though one has walked through centuries guided by a steady flame, and to see how something so small has carried so much of human life within its glow. From the earliest moments when families gathered scraps of fat from the hearth to render into tallow, to the treasured sweetness of beeswax reserved for sacred spaces, to the patient dipping of wicks and the silent cooling of tapers in storerooms, every detail of candle making has told a story not just of craft but of human rhythm itself. Each chapter has revealed another layer of meaning, reminding us that the candle was never only an object of necessity but also a companion of life, woven into the seasons, into rituals of faith, into market stalls, and into the simple tenderness of evening meals. To trace its history is to trace the very pattern of time before electricity, the rise of dusk, the gathering of families, the deepening of silence, the importance of patience, and the reverence for resources that could never be taken for granted. Candles, whether humble sticks of tallow or elegant beeswax tapers, were at the center of these moments, and so their story is inseparable from the story of how generations learned to dwell with darkness and shape light by hand. That is the quiet dignity of handmade light. It illuminates not only rooms but also the habits, values, and hearts of the people who depended on it. In remembering their making, we also remember the pace of life they created, the rhythm of dipping, the waiting for cooling, the storage for winter, the careful counting of supplies. All these practices slowed the household into harmony with time itself, reminding each member that light was earned, not assumed. Patience was woven into every flame, and respect was bound into every flicker. The candle's glow was not wasteful, not overwhelming, not taken lightly. It was savored, like bread baked slowly, or cloth woven by hand. To light a candle was to engage in a ritual of care, a gentle acknowledgement of the human need for brightness against shadow, warmth against cold, and hope against the long hours of night. And because each flame carried this weight of labor and love, its presence felt deeper than the sterile glow of our modern lights ever could. The sacredness of candles amplified this feeling. In monasteries where monks rose at midnight to chant in the flicker of beeswax, in chapels where altars gleamed with golden tapers, and in households where a prayer was whispered at the lighting of a wick, candles became symbols as well as tools. They were bridges between the earthly and the divine, between the visible and the invisible. Their rising smoke was thought to carry prayers upward. Their steady glow was read as a reflection of the eternal. Their fragile flame stood as a reminder of life itself, flickering, vulnerable, but capable of shining. And so, even for those who never crafted candles by hand, their meaning was felt deeply, shaping how communities saw light, not only as necessity, but as mystery. Yet beyond churches and monasteries, the everyday rituals of candlelight were equally profound. A single taper lit at supper could turn a meal into a moment of gathering, where shadows softened the faces of loved ones and conversation unfolded gently. A candle burning beside a bed gave reassurance to children and comfort to the weary. These moments were never dramatic, but they stitched together the fabric of ordinary evenings, filling them with warmth and calm. Candles allowed families to live within circles of light, drawing closer together as the darkness pressed outside. And within that closeness, bonds deepened, memories were made, and time slowed to its gentlest form. Such is the quiet magic of handmade light. It worked not by dazzling, but by softening, not by conquering darkness entirely, but by teaching people to live gracefully within its embrace. The journey of candles through markets and workshops revealed another part of their story, their place in community. Chandlers filled shelves with bundles of light, and buyers carried them home as surely as they carried flour or grain. To trade in candles was to trade in comfort, in safety, in the very means of living through the night. These exchanges remind us that even the humblest flame was part of an economic web, linking countryside to town, household to workshop, resource to need. Candles connected people, not only through the glow they provided, but through the shared recognition that light was precious, and that to secure it was to secure a measure of peace. And then came the legacy that extends into our present world, a legacy that does not fade even as electricity hums quietly in our walls. For still we light candles not because we must, but because we wish to return, if only for a moment, to that gentler rhythm. We light them at dinners, at vigils, at celebrations, at times of mourning and times of joy. We seek their glow not for visibility but for meaning, for the way they soften edges, quiet noise, and remind us of continuity with those who came before. To strike a match and see a flame catch is to touch the past, to feel the echo of centuries in which people coaxed light by hand. In that act lies the candle's true legacy. It is not a relic, but a living tradition, carried still in our gestures and in our longing for the calm it brings. Thus, the conclusion to this long story of handmade light is not an ending but a reminder. It reminds us of patience, of resourcefulness, of intimacy, of reverence. It reminds us that light, once a hard-won gift, is never to be taken for granted. It reminds us that even the humblest flame can carry meaning enough to shape a night, a prayer, or a memory. And most of all, it reminds us that human life has always been illuminated, not only by brilliance, but also by gentleness, by small, steady flames that warmed the dark and softened the silence. Even as our modern world glitters with instant brightness, the candle still speaks in its old voice, a whisper of calm, a bearer of tradition, a witness to the enduring human need for light that is both practical and profound. The eternal glow of handmade light may no longer guide our survival, but it continues to guide our hearts, carrying forward the quiet dignity of centuries into the present and the future.